He was the kind of pilot people assumed they already understood, not because he made it easy to dismiss him, but because everyone in that room had a story in their head about what a 31-year-old first-tour lieutenant with a car seat in his truck was supposed to be. Then his name went up on a whiteboard at Naval Air Station Fallon, and the room forgot what it thought it knew. Before we get into how it happened, drop a comment with where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Lieutenant Junior Grade Daniel Reyes checked into Strike Fighter Squadron 137, the Kestrels, at Naval Air Station Lemoore, California, on a Monday morning in early October. He carried one sea bag, a folder of orders, and a laminated photo of a 7-year-old tucked into his flight jacket's inner pocket, the kind of thing a man does without ever mentioning it to anyone. He was 5'11", built like someone who'd spent a decade doing physical work before anyone handed him a stick and throttle. And he had 11 years of Navy service already behind him by the time he walked into the ready room in Building 725. That number mattered more than anyone in the room bothered to ask about. Reyes entered at 19 as an aviation structural mechanic, spent 6 years working the flight line at NAS Oceana, keeping F-18s airworthy from the outside, before a chief he respected pushed him toward the Seaman to Admiral commissioning program. He'd earned his wings at 29, 3 years behind the typical track, and reported to his first fleet squadron, a lieutenant junior grade who looked to everyone around him like a guy who'd started late and might not have what it takes to catch up. Nobody stood when he walked in. A couple of pilots glanced at his name tape, then went back to their coffee. Lieutenant Grant Halsey, running the training schedule that morning, checked Reyes's name against the roster and said, without much weight behind it, "Reyes, workup starts Thursday. Try to keep pace." It wasn't unkind. It also wasn't a welcome. The loudest voice in the squadron was Lieutenant Cole Bishop, 4 years into Hornets, 1 deployment logged, and the kind of confidence that filled a room before he did. Near the front sat Lieutenant Marcus Boone, senior enough that he'd stopped needing to prove anything years ago. Beside Bishop sat Lieutenant Nora Kessler, quiet, exact, the kind of officer instructors briefed twice because she found the gap in a plan before they finished explaining it. By his second week, he had a pattern nobody in the squadron paid attention to. He was first through the gate at 05:30 and gone by 6:35 on the days he could manage it, driving 11 minutes to Liberty Elementary School on Liberty Boulevard to pick up his daughter Maya before the aftercare program closed its doors at 1700. On the days flight schedules ran long, a neighbor 2 doors down, a retired chief's widow named Dolores Vance, picked Maya up instead and kept her until Reyes could get there, usually with pizza cooling on the counter and a stack of second-grade homework already started. Bishop noticed the early departures before he noticed anything else about Reyes. On a Thursday in his 3rd week, during a debrief that ran 10 minutes past when Reyes needed to leave, Bishop said it loud enough for 6 people to hear. "Reyes, you sure the Navy knows you signed up for fighters and not the PTA? No offense, man, just an observation." A couple of pilots laughed. Kessler didn't, but she didn't say anything. Reyes closed his notebook, said nothing, and left for the gate. Halsey was near the door. He heard it. He filed it away. Not yet. What nobody in that ready room knew, because Reyes had never once volunteered it, was that he'd spent 6 years with his hands inside the guts of that exact airframe before he ever sat in the front seat of one, and that everything Bishop assumed was a distraction was in fact the only thing that had ever kept him steady enough to be good at any of it. Reyes grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, the son of a Navy mechanic who worked at Norfolk Naval Shipyard for 31 years and never once complained about a double shift. His mother drove a school bus route that started before sunrise. Nobody in his family had ever worn wings, but they raised him to believe that understanding how something worked, really worked, down in the parts nobody saw, mattered more than talking about it. He carried that into 6 years on the flight line at NAS Oceana, torque-wrenching panels, chasing hydraulic leaks at 2 in the morning, learning an F-18 structure the way most pilots never have to. By the time he sat in a cockpit for the first time, at 26 in the Aviation Officer Candidate School's flight induction program, he already knew what every warning light on that panel was connected to, because he'd replaced the wiring behind it himself. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, he studied at night after mandatory hours, not because the material was hard for him, but because he refused to let the 6 years he'd spent behind schedule show up as a gap in his knowledge. Instructors noted he asked fewer questions than his classmates, and usually already had the answer worked out on his own kneeboard before it was asked of him. He finished flight school with the highest systems knowledge score in his class, a fact nobody at VFA 137 had reason to know because nobody had asked. The weeks at Lemoore moved the way hard weeks do. Pre-dawn sim blocks, academic sessions that ran into the afternoon, low-level routes through the Sierra foothills. Reyes kept pace without ever standing out, flying clean sorties, debriefing in short, exact sentences, and leaving the moment the schedule allowed. What the squadron saw was a guy who left early. What they didn't see was what came after. Most nights, once Maya was asleep by 2000, Reyes sat at the kitchen table in his rental on Iowa Street with a stack of tactics manuals and a legal pad, working intercept geometry problems until his eyes gave out, usually somewhere past midnight. He signed up for the 0400 sim blocks nobody else wanted, the ones that let him be back at the school gate by 1600 the next day. There was one flight in November that nobody in the squadron would remember but him. A low-altitude training run through the foothills near Avenal, California, went sideways when a faulty angle of attack sensor started feeding him readings that didn't match what the airplane was actually doing. Most pilots at his experience level would have trusted the gauge. Reyes didn't. 6 years of feeling an airplane through a torque wrench had taught him what the instruments couldn't, and something about the way the jet was sitting in the air didn't match the number in front of him. He flew the aircraft, not the panel, leveled off on FIO, and brought it home clean. He wrote 4 lines about it in his personal logbook that night and never mentioned it to anyone, because to him it wasn't a story. It was the same instinct that had kept jets flying at Oceana for 6 years, just pointed in a new direction. Dolores Vance was the only one who came close to noticing. She mentioned once, dropping Maya off on a Tuesday, that his kitchen light was still on when she'd walked her dog at 11 the night before. Reyes said he'd been catching up on paperwork. She didn't push it. What she didn't know was that the paperwork was intercept geometry, and that Reyes had made the same trade his whole life, sleep for preparation, and never once believed it cost more than it was worth. In February, word came down through Building 725 that 2 slots had opened for the Advanced Tactics Detachment at Naval Air Station Fallon, Nevada, the pipeline that fed the Navy's Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor program. Bishop said he was putting his name in before the brief even finished. Boone just nodded once, which the room understood mean he'd already decided. Nobody noticed Reyes walk down to the squadron admin office that same afternoon, asked the yeoman on duty for the nomination form, and quietly submitted his package before he left to make the 1650 pickup at Liberty Elementary. Selection wasn't close to guaranteed. Historically, fewer than 1 nominated pilot in 5 made the cut, and the review board at Naval Air Forces Pacific was merciless about fitness reports, sim performance, and a written tactics exam that eliminated most candidates before they ever touched a simulator seat. Reyes didn't tell anyone he'd submitted his package, not Bishop, not Kessler, not even Dolores Vance, though he did ask her, almost in passing, if she'd be able to handle a few extra pickups in March if his schedule got heavier. She said of course, and didn't ask why. 3 weeks later, the results routed to Lieutenant Commander Halsey's inbox on a Wednesday morning. He read the message once, then a second time, then walked straight to the squadron duty office and called an all-hands muster at 1300 that same day. The ready room in Building 725 filled in fast, folding chairs scraping against tile, pilots settling in, already assuming they knew how this would go. Bishop's slot, probably. Maybe Boone's, if he'd decided instructing suited him more than another deployment.
Halsey stood at the front, holding the printed message at his side for a moment before he spoke, the way a man does when he wants to get the words exactly right. He said, "One name came back selected, top of the board's entire ranking, highest tactics written score submitted from any squadron on this base this cycle. Perfect marks on the systems and merge plans section, the part that usually eats people alive." He scanned the rows, then read the name slowly, like he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Lieutenant Junior Grade Daniel Reyes. The room went still. Not ordinary quiet, but the particular stillness of a fact refusing to fit the picture people had already built in their heads. Bishop set his coffee down without seeming to notice he'd done it. Kessler's eyebrows went up and stayed there. Boone found Reyes exactly where he always sat, near the back, wearing the same even expression he wore through every debrief, giving nothing away. "Reyes," Halsey said, "you want to explain why nobody in this squadron knew you'd even put your name in for this?" Reyes considered it the way he considered most things, carefully, without rushing to fill the silence. "Nobody asked, sir." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the room and were quickly swallowed. Halsey didn't laugh. He kept reading. The board's written comments used language that usually didn't show up in these packages. An unusually complete understanding of airframe systems limitations, the kind instructors typically only see in pilots several years further along in their careers. On the merge plan portion of the exam, the section that eliminated roughly half the applicant pool every cycle, Reyes hadn't just passed, he'd proposed a fuel management contingency built on a systems failure mode most candidates never considered, because most candidates had never spent 6 years replacing the parts that failed. 2 evaluators had flagged it for their own teaching material before the board had even finished ranking the pool. He'd been preparing for months. The 0400 sim blocks nobody wanted, the legal pad full of intercept geometry at the kitchen table on Iowa Street, the years on the flight line at Oceana that everyone in this room had mistaken for a late start instead of a head start. And he had never once asked anyone in that squadron to believe in him before the work was already done. The days that followed carried a shift nobody announced out loud. Bishop went quiet for the better part of 2 days. On the 3rd, he found Reyes in the mechanic hangar checking a discrepancy sheet and asked if, without his usual performance attached, Reyes would walk him through the fuel contingency logic sometime. Reyes said sure, and spent 35 minutes at a workbench explaining failure modes the way a mechanic explains an engine, not the way a pilot recites a checklist. Bishop listened the way people listen when they realize mid-conversation they'd been underestimating someone for weeks.
Kessler admitted at the squadron bar that night that she'd read him completely wrong. Boone said nothing directly, but the next flight schedule paired Reyes with him for a 2-ship training sortie in a fighter squadron, its own quiet form of respect. Reyes left for Fallon in April. Maya stayed behind in Lemoore with Dolores Vance for 6 weeks, a bag packed with her favorite books and a promise from her father that he'd call every night at 19:30, no matter what the schedule looked like. Naval Air Station Fallon sat in a high desert basin outside Reno, Nevada, ringed by mountains that turned the afternoon light hard and flat by 4 o'clock. The detachment was every difficult thing its reputation promised. Dissimilar air combat against instructor pilots flying adversary aircraft built specifically to exploit whatever weakness a young pilot hadn't found in himself yet. Sorties stacked back to back, debriefs running 3 hours for every hour flown, a pace that left most candidates running on 4 hours of sleep by the second week. Reyes called Maya every night at 19:30 from the visiting officers' quarters, building 1220, room 114, a cinder block room with a single window facing the flight line. Some nights the call lasted 20 minutes, Maya reading him a page from whatever book she was working through. Some nights it lasted 3 minutes because a debrief ran long and he had to catch her before Dolores put her to bed. He never missed a night. He built the entire 6 weeks around that single non-negotiable line item, the same way he'd built every schedule since Elena died 2 years earlier, structuring exhaustion around the one thing that couldn't slip.
He struggled early, badly by his own private assessment, though nobody watching from outside would have called it that yet. In his fourth sortie, flying defensive against two adversary aircraft over the Fallon Range, he made a read half a second too slow, got himself gunned clean, and sat through a debrief in Building 715 where a two-decade veteran instructor named Commander Elaine Voss took his tape apart frame by frame in front of 5 other pilots. She wasn't cruel about it. She didn't need to be. The tape spoke for itself, and it said Reyes hesitated at the exact moment hesitation cost the most. It was the kind of failure that could have become, for a less steady pilot, proof that Bishop's comment back in Lemoore had something onto it after all. Too old, too far behind, too much of his attention parceled out to a life the cockpit didn't leave room for. That night, alone in room 114, Reyes let himself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as it took to eat a microwaved dinner standing at the counter. Then he opened his laptop and went to work the way he'd gone to work his entire adult life, without waiting for the feeling to pass first. He watched the tape 9 times, wrote every decision point in a legal pad in his own shorthand, and rebuilt the merge from the first radar contact forward, the same way he used to trace a hydraulic leak backward through a wiring diagram until he found the fitting that had actually failed. 2 other candidates gunned that week handled it differently. One told anyone who'd listened that the instructor had flown the geometry unfairly. The other went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with confidence draining out of him sortie by sortie, the particular kind of quiet that comes from a pilot starting to believe a loss is a verdict on who he is. Reyes did neither. He went to the instructor cadre office in Building 715 the next morning and asked specifically and without apology for one more look at the tape outside the formal debrief window. Commander Voss, who rarely gave anyone extra time, agreed, mostly out of curiosity who was asking twice. 45 minutes later, working frame by frame through the merge, she wasn't just answering his questions anymore. She was asking a few of her own, the kind an instructor asks when she started reconsidering who's sitting across from her. 4 days later, Reyes flew the same scenario type again and won it clean, in a way that made the debrief room noticeably quieter than the loss had. Where most pilots fly the rematch cautious, overcorrecting out of fear, Reyes flew it exactly as he had the first time, aggressive where aggression made sense, patient where patience made sense. The fix wasn't about caution, it was about seeing the merge 1/2 second earlier, and half a second in that airplane, he already knew from 6 years of watching what happens when systems fail by exactly that margin, was the difference between everything and nothing. He called Maya that night at 19:30 and told her he had a good day at work. He didn't mention the loss from 4 days earlier. She told him about a spelling test. Neither of them knew it yet that 1,100 miles away, in a hangar bay in Fallon, his name had already started coming up in conversations he wasn't part of. By the 5th week, something had shifted in the instructor cadre that Reyes himself hadn't fully clocked. Commander Voss started pulling his tapes for the morning academic briefs, not to critique them in front of the class like she did with most candidates, but to walk through his decision-making as an example of how a merge plan should account for systems limitations most pilots never thought to build in. She never singled him out by name in those sessions. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room had flown against him by then and knew whose tape it was. Reyes noticed the shift mostly in small practical ways, fewer questions repeated to him in debrief. Instructors who used to explain a concept twice now explained it once and moved on, the way they did for candidates they trusted to keep up without hand-holding. He didn't think much about what it meant. He was too busy managing the only 2 things that had ever mattered to him at once, flying clean and getting back to room 114 to call his daughter.
The detachment's final graded evaluation fell on a Thursday in the 5th week, a full mission profile against 2 instructor-flown adversaries designed to expose whatever gaps remained in a candidate's tactical picture. Reyes flew lead on a 2-ship,
paired with a lieutenant from a squadron out of Naval Air Station Oceana running an offensive counter-air profile against airspace defended by Commander Voss and a second instructor flying an aggressor jet configured to simulate a threat aircraft with the performance advantage. The mission went sideways early, the way check rides are built to make them. A simulated radar failure on his wingman's aircraft, called in by the range controller 11 minutes into the profile, meant Reyes was suddenly flying the tactical picture for both jets, with half the sensor coverage the mission had been briefed to expect. It was exactly the kind of complication that separated candidates who'd memorized a plan from candidates who understood the airplane well enough to build a new one in real time. He didn't panic and he didn't improvise blind. He fell back on the same instinct that had brought him home clean over the Sierra foothills back in November, the instinct built from 6 years of knowing an F-18 from the inside out. He restructured the intercept geometry around his wingman's degraded picture, took over threat identification for both aircraft, and executed a defensive to offensive transition so clean that when the range controller called the exercise complete, there was a pause on the radio frequency before Voss's voice came back, flat and unreadable, telling both aircraft to return to base. In the debrief room in Building 715 afterward, the tape ran twice before anyone spoke. Voss finally sat back from the console, arms crossed, looking at Reyes across the table the way a hard-edged instructor looks at someone she stopped needing to test. "Reyes," she said, "where the hell have you been?" He said he'd been working on it. It was the same 4 words he'd said after nearly every hard thing he'd ever done, and it was, as far as he was concerned, the entire truth. That tape didn't stay in the debrief room. Within 2 days, it had been pulled and shown to the incoming class as a teaching example, the same fate his fuel contingency plan from the selection exam had already met months earlier. Word moves fast in a community as small as strike fighter aviation, and by the time the final week started, instructors 2 ranks above Voss were asking around about the lieutenant from Lemoore who talked his wingman through a sensor failure like he'd built the jet himself. None of it changed Reyes's routine. He still called Maya every night at 19:30. He still ran through his own personal debrief notes afterward at the small desk in room 114, because 6 weeks in, he still didn't fully believe any of it was finished until it was finished. Dolores Vance mentioned on one of the calls that Maya had drawn a picture of an airplane for her class's family show and tell, and that she'd told her teacher her dad flew jets and fixed them too, because he'd done both. Reyes sat with that for a long moment after he hung up, in a way none of the tape reviews or debrief praise from that week had quite managed to reach. He had 6 days left at Fallon. He didn't know yet that the instructor cadre had already started talking quietly about what to write on the whiteboard on the final night, or that for the first time in 11 years, Commander Voss had told another instructor she didn't think a joke would be the right call at all. The final week at Fallon ran differently than the 5 before it, not because the flying eased up, but because the candidates could feel the detachment closing in around them, the way any 6 weeks does when the end becomes visible. Reyes flew 2 more graded profiles, both clean, both unremarkable in the way that meant he'd stopped needing to be remarkable to prove anything. He'd already proven what needed proving. Now he was just finishing the work. He spent his few free hours the way he'd spent most of the 6 weeks, at the small desk in room 114, going back through his own logbook entries from the entire detachment, the way he used to go back through maintenance logs at Oceana, looking for a pattern he might have missed the first time. He found one. Every mistake he made across the 6 weeks traced back to the same half-second delay, the gap between seeing information and trusting it enough to act. He wrote a single line at the bottom of the page, "Trust to read faster." It wasn't dramatic, it was the kind of note a mechanic leaves for the next shift, plain and useful, and meant to be acted on, not admired.
Commander Voss called a short instructor-only meeting on the Tuesday before graduation in a windowless room in Building 715 that smelled of old coffee and dry erase marker. Tradition at Fallon held that the top-performing candidate in each detachment got named by the instructor cadre in front of the whole class on the final night. Most call signs were jokes, built on some embarrassing moment from the 6 weeks, a bad landing, a mixed-up radio call, a nickname that stuck because it was funny and a little cruel. The room went around the table debating names for 4 other candidates in under 15 minutes, laughing at most of them. When Reyes's name came up, the room went quiet in a different way. Nobody had a joke on him. 6 weeks of watching him fly, debrief, and disappear back to his room by 1930 every night hadn't given anyone in that cadre a single embarrassing story to work with. One of the younger instructors offered something about him always leaving early, a play on his nightly calls home, and Voss shut it down flatly before it went any further. That's not what this is, and she didn't explain herself further. Nobody pushed.
She'd pulled his full record that morning, not just the tape reviews, but the selection package from Lemoore, the systems knowledge scores from Pensacola, the 6 years of maintenance chief endorsements from his enlisted file at Oceana. She read through it twice at her desk before the meeting, the way she read through very few packages in a given year. What struck her wasn't any single data point, it was the through line. Every hard thing this man had ever been handed, he'd absorbed quietly and turned into competence nobody had asked him to develop. And he'd done it while raising a kid alone 1,100 miles from where he was standing right now. She thought about the wiring diagram logic behind his merge plans, the way he read a systems failure, the way most pilots read a checklist, instinctively, without translation. She thought about the gun kill in week 1 and the clean win 4 days later, and the fact that nobody outside that cinderblock room had known what it cost him to get from one to the other. She set her pen down on the meeting table. "I've got it," she said. She didn't share it with the room yet. She wanted to say it once on the final night and have it land the way it deserved to. Reyes had no idea any of this was happening. He spent that Tuesday night on the phone with Maya a few minutes longer than usual, listening to her explain in the exhaustive detail only a 7-year-old can manage the plot of a book about a dog who learns to fly a kite. He told her 2 more days and he'd be home. She asked if he was going to get a call sign like the pilots in the shows she watched with Dolores. He said maybe, and that if he did, he'd tell her what it meant. He hung up, looked over his notes one more time, and turned off the light in room 114 without knowing that 1,100 miles away and 2 buildings over, a woman who'd spent 11 years handing out mostly forgettable nicknames had already decided his was going to be the one that stuck for the rest of his career. The final night at Fallon fell on a Thursday, graduation formalities scheduled for the following morning, but the tradition itself happened after hours in the same room where every debrief of the last 6 weeks had taken place, Building 715, the long table pushed back against the wall to make room for folding chairs and a cooler someone had wheeled in from the mess. It wasn't a party exactly. It was closer to a court settling its final business, the instructor cadre standing at the front, the graduating candidates seated in rows, still half in their flight suits from the day's last sortie. Reyes sat near the back, the same seat he'd picked in any ready room since Lemoore, out of habit more than anything else. He'd called Maya at 1930 as always, told her he'd know something by the time she woke up in the morning, and promised again that he'd explain whatever it was once he was home to say it to her face. She made him promise twice. Commander Voss stood at the front with a dry erase marker in hand, working through the other 4 candidates first, the way the tradition always went, ribbing each one about some specific failure or embarrassing moment from the 6 weeks before writing something clever, sometimes a little cruel, on the whiteboard mounted behind her. A candidate from a squadron out of Naval Air Station Oceana got a name out of a botched radio call in week 2 that had every instructor in the room laughing before Voss even finished the story. Another got needled over a hard landing that had cracked a taxi light lens on the first week's cross-country flight.
The room laughed each time, loose and easy, 6 weeks of pressure finally allowed to unwind. Then Voss got to Reyes, and the tone in the room changed before she said a single word. She didn't reach for a story like she had with the others. She stood there for a moment with the marker still capped in her hand, looking down to a single sheet of paper she'd brought up with her, the kind of pause that told the room this one was going to be different. I've been doing this 11 years. I've made a lot of call signs in that time. Most of them are jokes, and they're supposed to be. This one isn't going to be. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't for the other 4 names, the particular quiet of a group realizing all at once that they'd been braced for the wrong kind of moment. Bishop, who'd flown up from Lemoore to watch the graduation the next morning and slipped into the back of the room 20 minutes ago, straightened up in his seat. Kessler, seated 2 rows ahead of him, turned slightly towards Reyes without seeming to mean to. Voss set the sheet of paper down and started talking without reading from it, the details clearly ones she'd carried in her head since Tuesday's meeting. She told the room about the fuel contingency logic from the selection exam back in Lemoore, the one 2 evaluators had already folded into their own lesson plans before Reyes had set foot on this base. She told them about the gun kill in week 1, the failure that could have ended a candidate's confidence right there, and the fact that nobody in this room had known until she pulled his tape review notes that week exactly how close it had come to breaking him the way it had broken 2 other candidates in that same class.
She told them about the sensor failure on the final evaluation, the moment where a lesser pilot would have been needed to be told what to do, and Reyes had simply already known, the way a man knows a system when he's spent years replacing its parts by hand. She told them, because by then she'd learned it too, about the 6 years on the flight line at Oceana, about a commissioning program most of this room had never heard of, about a 7-year-old girl back in Lemoore who got a phone call every single night at 19:30, no matter what the schedule demanded. He didn't say 2 words about any of it the entire 6 weeks, Voss said. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't think it was anybody's business but his. She uncapped the marker. The room, 30 people who'd spent 6 weeks watching each other get taken apart frame by frame in this exact space, sat in a silence that had actual weight to it now, the kind that comes right before something gets said that nobody in the room is going to forget hearing. Voss wrote a single word on the whiteboard, no flourish, no punchline trailing after it the way there had been for the other 4 names that night. She capped the marker, set it down on the ledge below the board, and stepped back so the whole room could see it clearly. Anchor. Nobody laughed the way they usually laughed at a new call sign going up. The room sat with it this time, 30 pilots who'd spent 6 weeks watching each other get picked apart in this exact space, realizing all at once that they'd been sharing a class with someone exceptional the entire time and hadn't fully understood it until it was written down in front of them. "You want to know why?" Voss said, though nobody had asked. "It's because every time this detachment threw something at him that should have knocked him off his plan, he didn't drift. Sensor failure, wingman down, a loss in week 1 that would have broken half of the pilots in this room. He held the same position every time. That's not a nickname for being quiet. That's what he actually is." Reyes sat with his hands loosely folded on the table in front of him, the same posture he carried into every debrief since Lemoore, and said only, "Thank you, ma'am." It was the honest and complete extent of what needed saying, and everyone in the room understood, watching him say it, that he meant it exactly that much, and not 1 word more. Bishop was the first one to move. He crossed the room before the murmur of conversation had even fully started back up, stuck his hand out, and said, "Anchor, huh?" Not quite an apology, but clearly carrying the weight of one underneath it. Reyes shook his hand and said it was good to see him, and that was the entire exchange, which was somehow enough for both of them. Kessler caught him at the door on the way out and said she owed him a conversation about a merge plan sometime, the kind of thing she said when she meant she'd read someone completely wrong for 6 weeks and wanted him to know she'd noticed.
Voss found him last, once most of the room had cleared out toward the cooler, and told him without any of the formality from a few minutes ago that she'd be requesting him back at Fallon as an instructor candidate once he had a fleet tour under his belt. He said he'd think about it, and meant that, too, because a decision like that wasn't his to make alone anymore. It hadn't been his to make alone for 2 years. He got back to room 114 a little after 10 p.m., later than his usual call time, and dialed Maya's number anyway, hoping Dolores had let her stay up. She had. Maya answered on the second ring, already half whispering the way kids do when they think staying up counts less if they're quiet about it. "Did you get one?" she asked before he'd said anything else. "I did," he said. "What is it?" He thought about how to explain it to a 7-year-old and found, in the end, that the truest version was also the simplest one. "It's called anchor," he said. "It means something that stays steady, something a ship holds onto so it doesn't drift off in the current, even when the water gets rough." There was a pause on the line, the kind that meant she was turning the idea over. "Like you," she said finally, "when I have a bad dream." He sat down on the edge of the bed in room 114 and didn't say anything for a second, because that was closer to the truth than anything Voss had said in the debrief room 20 minutes ago, closer than the tape reviews or the fuel contingency logic or any of the 6 weeks that had led to this. She told him good night and handed the phone back to Dolores, who said Maya had drawn another airplane picture that day, this one with a word bubble coming out of the cockpit that just said, "Dad." Reyes thanked her, hung up, and sat in the quiet of the visiting officer's quarters for a long moment before he started packing his bag for the flight home the next morning. He had no idea yet that word of the call sign had already reached VFA 137 back in Lemoore, and by the time his wheels touched down at Naval Air Station Lemoore the following afternoon, the ready room in Building 725 would already know exactly what to call him when he walked back through the door. Reyes flew back into Lemoore 2 days later, same sea bag over his shoulder, same quiet expression he'd carried through 6 weeks of debriefs at Fallon. Nobody had told him the squadron already knew. Word travels fast in a community as small as naval strike fighter aviation, and by the time his flight touched down, half of VFA 137 had already heard the word anchor second-hand from a maintenance chief who'd heard it from a friend at Fallon 2 days before Reyes had even packed his bag. He walked into the ready room in Building 725 a little after 1400, expecting the same room he'd left 6 weeks earlier, the one where people glanced at his name tape and went back to their coffee. Instead, Bishop stood up before Reyes made it 3 steps past the door. Kessler pulled out the chair beside her own without saying anything. Boone nodded once from across the room, worth more in that particular language than most people's speeches. Halsey came out of his office, shook Reyes' hand, and said only, "Heard you had a good 6 weeks," which from Halsey counted as high praise. Reyes set his bag down, sat where he was offered, and let the conversation fill in around him the way it never had before he'd left. The room hadn't changed its walls or its whiteboard, but it had become, in every way that mattered, a different room. He picked Maya up from Liberty Elementary at 16:20 that same afternoon, and when she saw him waiting by the flagpole instead of Dolores, she ran the last 20 feet into his arms and didn't ask him a single question about the call sign until they were both in the truck, because by then, apparently, some things could wait until you were home. 2 deployments followed over the next several years, both aboard the carrier USS Carl Vinson, and a posting afterward as a tactics instructor himself, a role Voss had, in fact, made good on requesting him for. Maya grew up mostly in base housing at Lemoore and later at Naval Air Station Fallon, old enough by the second posting to understand exactly what her father did and exactly what it had cost him to get there, because he never hid the cost from her the way some parents try to. Years later, a Navy public affairs writer working on a feature about single parents in fleet aviation reached out for an interview, and Reyes agreed to it on the condition that Maya, by then a teenager, could read it before it ran. He answered every question directly and declined, gently but firmly, to make any of it sound more dramatic than it had actually felt at the time. Asked about the comment in his first month at Lemoore, the PTA remark, Reyes was quiet for a moment before saying he honestly hadn't thought about it much since. Other people's read on him had never been the most useful information available to him in any given room. Asked what got him through the hardest stretch at Fallon, he thought about it, seriously, the way he thought about most things. "I wasn't trying to prove anything to anybody," he said. "Not to the squadron, not to the guy who made the PTA comment, not to the board that almost didn't pick me. I think I was just trying to find out if what I already believed about myself was true. I'd believed it a long time, I just hadn't tested it with anybody watching." He'd tested it. He'd been right. The thing about pilots like Daniel Reyes, the ones a room learns to overlook because they never insist on being seen, the ones who take the 04 sim block nobody wants and still make it to the school gate by 1700, who lose clean and come back 4 days later, having already fixed what broke, is that they are very often right about themselves long before anyone else catches up. Not because the world eventually notices, sometimes it takes years, but because the work was never actually for the room in the first place. It was for something steadier than applause, something closer to a promise made to one small person who was counting on him to keep it. Somewhere in Lemoore, California, there's a photograph on a hallway wall in the Reyes house, Maya at 7, standing beside her father in his flight suit, both of them squinting into the sun on the day he came home from Fallon. She kept the airplane drawing from second grade, too, the one with Dad in the word bubble, taped inside a closet door where nobody but the two of them ever really sees it. Nobody out there wears a name tape. Nobody there ever needed to be told twice what the word anchor actually meant.